Hello and welcome to Lit Illuminated. This is a space for us to talk about books, the way that we connect to each book and understand our story within that story, as well as how it connects us to the larger story around us. Today, we are going to be looking at Tessa Hulls' graphic memoir, Feeding Ghosts. This book was in my periphery a little bit. She has worked from the Seattle area and connected to some writers that I know in that area as well. But it wasn't until it was listed as the Pulitzer that I was like, oh, I really need to get that. And so I just ordered it right away and picked it up. So I love a graphic memoir. I love that it provides additional layers to the personal story, that you're getting someone's journey, but then you're also getting the visuals of how they're interpreting that in addition to the words. So I'm always in that hybrid space. I love the ways that image and story text can work together. And in this one, she also includes photographs. So not only do we have the drawn story and the written story, but then we also have photographs that add another layer, another way of the story being told. So I did not realize this when I bought it, but that this really is the heart of this book is about looking at the narrative of her lineage. So looking at her grandmother, her mother, and herself, and the stories within those stories, and then how they're connected, where the disconnects were, where the understanding needed to be built through the research and the looking through and the lens of diving back into the history. It's interesting in this case, the grandmother was a writer, had written her own memoir, and at one point when Tessa's looking at it, realizing the kind of unreliableness of that narrator, that some of the things didn't seem quite right, but that in some way she was trying to write her story, and her grandmother had a mental breakdown after they left, fled China, and that this idea that she continued to write her whole life afterwards was a way of her trying to navigate and keep telling the story or rewriting the story, make sense of the story. And so that was like this beautiful layer on top of this memoir, that from the grandmother and this idea of writing story, we have the granddaughter writing story in that space. So really at the heart of this is trying to discover the past in ways to understand the present. It's weaving history into the personal as well, which I love when people are able to do that, to provide historical events and how it's connected to what was happening in their family life, and those experiences. There's a returning throughout. There's a train ride. There's returning to old homes. There's returning to family that was left behind in China. There's returning to old narratives. There's this kind of digging and excavating the past to continue to understand the future, but also in those spaces, in the returning, there's those moments of what does it look like now? Like, is that home even there? Is it a strip mall, or is it still there? And do we have access to it? Can we go into that space? And so I thought that was really interesting. There's returning to hospitals, mental hospitals, to boarding schools. So there's something in the way that place also holds narrative, and that in the research and trying to understand that the returning to place allows more understanding. There was some interesting parallels, and in no way is my story anywhere close to this, but I wrote a very similar story about connecting to my grandmother and my great grandmother, and I used going back to place to kind of get those spaces that you couldn't quite understand until you were actually there. And so I thought, Tessa did a great job of bringing us into those spaces and those discovery moments for herself. So the other thing that was really interesting in this is that it's not always just about our own personal narrative. It's also about our cultural narrative and what that means, and how the culture understanding and your understanding, and especially I think Tessa talks about this as an immigrant children, that that's where misunderstanding can happen, that it provides this space of, but I'm doing something different, or I see the world differently than how you see it. And so there's this clash in there. And I think throughout she's brutally honest about the clashes and the misunderstanding and the frustrations between her and her mom. But she allows us in that honesty to move through the story. So there's a couple things that I wanted to, I usually like to give you some quotes. And so this one is, all history is contested. Evidence exists as a field of dots, and we connect them according to what lenses we employ to examine the past. I feel like in some way that provides the essence of all of this, that even when she's talking about the history of the country, the history of her family, the history of herself, that there's lenses that we deploy on that too. I know that wasn't what she was talking about in that space, but I think overall it is true and accurate that that we are putting some kind of lens on the way that we're looking through our story, which goes back to the grandmother's writing her memoir, and when Tessa read them saying like that doesn't seem right, it was her lens of seeing that. It wasn't a rewriting of history. It was her lens within the space that she was seeing that. And even in some ways, it was like trying to write the situation better than what it was, or to make it different to what it was. But isn't that what we're sometimes trying to do? I don't know. These are good questions to ask as you're moving through this. But then the other one, and I'll actually show the image if you're watching it on YouTube instead of listening to it on the podcast apps, is that there's this great image of a door. And I'm just going to read them first, and then I'll show it up there. And she says, it's the great tragedy of immigrant parents. They opened the door for us, and we betray them by walking through it and becoming children of a different world. And I thought that was an interesting way to showcase and highlight and bring the theme around some of the issues with her and her mom in that space. So I'll try to show it there. So it's this one here of the door and going through in that space. And there's something about that, the doorway image, that makes it more visual. You get the visual in the book itself, but then also the understanding of that, like, we're going to open a door for you, but then we get mad that you actually went through that door, or we don't understand why you went through that door, and that you opened it. But one of the big things that I wanted to talk about in this space today is that the book itself hosts and holds exactly what I'm trying to do here in Lit Illuminated, and that is that books provide a space for us to navigate ourselves, to navigate our story, to navigate and understand the world around us, to broaden our perspective of how we are also connected to the larger community. And that it doesn't matter if it's memoir or fiction. There's something about the patterns, the symbols, the metaphors, the story arc that allows us to reflect back on ourselves. Now, you can just read it for entertainment's sake and just say, oh, that was great. But if you think about it, there's always things that resonate with you. And if you pause and think about those things that resonate with you, or the patterns or things that you keep coming back to, it's a way to start like looking at yourself. Like, why do I keep going? Why am I drawn to those kind of characters? Why do I, look at things this way? Or when this happens in a story, I feel this way. And I feel like we don't often give credit to books in the space that they help us navigate and understand our lives. And when I read this on page 233 of this book, I was like, oh my gosh, that's Lit Illuminated. That is what I'm trying to do in this space. So I am going to read the whole quote. So just to show the image again, if you're looking on YouTube, it has her face, and then in her brain, it has her going in the library up on the little ladder and grabbing some books. I'm going to read that quote here. I discovered the rules of healthy emotional interactions through books, devouring the fictional lives of characters and creating an index reference library of human behavior in my mind. Whenever I encountered an instance I didn't understand, I scanned the archives of everything I had ever read until I found something that could provide the answer. I took refuge in the comforting solidarity of written stories, in their consistency and the fact that they could be trusted to not suddenly change. In this way, reading taught me the social codes of connection while also decoding the mystery of my mother and her ghost twin, helping me understand that the volatility of my mother's emotional world was visible to everyone except her. So I was thrilled to see this space of how books impacted Tessa's life and how it helped her navigate the world around her and became that space that she returned to understand. And in that, she talked about that they didn't change, that the stories remained the same. In that, you can change and your understanding can change as you grow and learn. This is much like if you read a text and then you go back to it later, how often what you're pulling out of it is different. The story remained the same. You changed, or your understanding of the world around you changed. But the key here is that books provide that space for us to self-analyze ourselves, but also to look at the world around us. And in this case, she was looking at her mother and those experiences there and what she was learning about the world around her, as well as through the stories. So I would recommend picking up this beautiful graphic memoir, Feeding Ghosts by Tessa Hulls. And I think it was a really beautiful investigation of the lineage, the stories that come to us through heritage, through ancestors, those stories that are impacted by history that we hold and we carry, even though we are far away from that history and that cultures, essentially, that they're still part of us and we still need to navigate and understand those because they impact us on a daily basis, whether we know it or not. And this is a way to allow stories to open up those spaces for us. Thank you for joining me for another Lit Illuminated. I look forward to connecting with you next time.